Welcome to this video on big issues facing the UK economy in 2016. As I'm sure you know, it's essential for both AS and A2 macro exams to relate your answers to what's happening in the real world. In essays you'll be evaluating every paragraph, and one of the best ways to do this is by using real life examples from the UK economy. I'm going to look at some of the key issues facing the UK economy, and remember, don't see each issue as a separate one, as they're all interlinked in some way, and all relate to the main macro objectives of low unemployment, sustainable growth, low inflation, and improved balance on the current account. And of course, the fifth one really, George Osborne's obsession with reducing the budget deficit. Anyway, hope you enjoy it, and you all stay awake until the end. Okay, so the first big issue to look at is the budget deficit. Last year, the UK had a budget deficit of just over 90 billion. I must apologise for this lightsaber, but I quite like it. So, just there, 90 billion. Forecast for the end of this financial year, which is almost at an end now, George Osborne has forecasted to be somewhere in the region of about 72 billion. We should be looking at the dark green ones here. And then he expects by 2019-20 to be actually running a surplus. So let's just remind ourselves what a budget deficit is. So a budget deficit means the government is spending more than it is receiving from tax revenue. And this has been an ongoing issue since the credit crunch, and it has been reduced. George Osborne obviously promised to get a surplus by 2019-20. And the main way George Osborne is going to achieve this, or has been achieving this, is by reducing government spending in all areas. The only protected areas are NHS, education up to 16, and foreign aid. And what we've seen is significant cuts, especially in welfare, in policing, big cuts to local councils, and defence spending, and many other areas as well. The impact is, and this second graph here illustrates this quite well. Big impact here is, this is only showing the changes in the budget 2016, but the tax and benefit changes, as you can see, are having a much worse effect on those on low incomes. In fact, those on higher incomes have actually benefited from the changes in the tax and benefit system in 2016. So there's one really important evaluation to put there is that certainly those on low incomes in the UK have suffered and have paid a bigger price for the attempts to cut the budget deficit than those on higher incomes. And of course, one of the reasons for that is that those on low incomes are much more reliant on welfare and benefits, and that's one of the main areas that George Osborne's been cutting. Now, in your essays, this is obviously what George Osborne doing is one way of reducing the budget deficit. A good thing, a way to evaluate in your essays is to consider alternatives. And the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn have a very different approach to reducing the budget deficit. And they're much more looking at, instead of such significant cuts in government spending, they're looking for more tax on big business, making sure those companies like Google and Starbucks pay their fair share. Also, that they're prepared to tax those on higher incomes more so that those on lower incomes don't suffer as much. And also, therefore, to do less government spending cuts. So this is a really important thing. A way to evaluate is to consider alternatives. Also, the Labour Party say that its borrowing is so low. Borrowing costs are so low for the government at the moment that this is the ideal time to actually borrow more money for the long term and invest in infrastructure, because it's never been so cheap for the government to borrow money. And obviously that would help the long-term economic growth and shifting the long-run aggregate supply. So you've got alternatives there, very extreme and big differences in the view of the current Conservative government and the view of the opposition Labour Party. So that's a good thing to do, is to bring in those different views, and that's a way of evaluating and coming up with alternatives. The final thing I want to say here, obviously cutting government spending does have an impact on growth, and also growth has been predicted or forecast to actually be a bit slower than George Osborne expected. So that's going to make it harder to reduce this budget deficit, because if growth is a bit lower than expected, the government's going to get less tax receipts, less tax coming in, because businesses are going to make less profit, so they're going to pay less corporation tax. Less people will be earning as much income, so they'll be paying less income tax. And consumers will be spending a little less and therefore paying a little less VAT. So there'll be less tax receipts coming in, so therefore it'll make it even harder to reduce this budget deficit. And the final trade-off I want to say here is reducing the budget deficit and significant cuts in government spending has an impact on the long-term growth of an economy, because that means the government isn't perhaps investing as much in long-term supply-side policies to boost long-term growth. And so there's a big trade-off here. So always think about trade-offs. The government does one thing, it's going to have an impact on something else. But we'll come back to the budget deficit as we look through some of the other slides. But certainly that's almost like the big cloud over the UK economy at the moment. Anything that the government does to reduce the budget deficit has a knock-on effect in other areas. Another problem facing the UK at the moment is world economic slowdown. We've seen lower growth rates in many economies in 2015 and again in 2016. A big example is China, who traditionally, if you look in the past, have had growth rates of over 12-14%, and even recently growth rates up to 2010 of around 10%. But growth is forecast to drop to 6% or perhaps even lower. We don't know how accurate those figures are. And that has an impact on the UK economy. And the main impact it has is it impacts on demand for our exports. So if I just show you this. So if you just remember, AD is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So clearly it has an impact on I, and therefore it will have an impact on aggregate demand. At the same time, if you remember from the previous slide when we were talking about the budget deficit, we're already seeing G, government spending, being reduced, and so clearly the last thing we want is a reduction in exports as well. I mean, we're also seeing a slowdown or a slow rate of growth in the EU, where nearly 50% of our exports go to, so that's having an impact on our demand for our exports. And we're also seeing a slowdown and troubles in Brazil, which is one of the big growing economies in the world. One really good example of what's known as a demand side shock to the UK of the slowdown in China is the steel industry. Because of the slowdown in China, there's been less demand in China for Chinese steel, and they've got over capacity as far as steel. So they're producing more steel than they actually need. So what they're actually doing is dumping a lot of this steel in the EU, very low price steel, and UK firms can't compete with this low price steel. And we've already seen the closure of steel plants in Redcar and elsewhere. And as I do this video, Tata have just announced they're going to sell their steel plants in the UK, including Port Talbot, and the government's umming and ahhing, deciding what to do. But I mean, this is going to cost thousands and thousands of jobs in the UK. So this is a direct impact of Chinese slowdown, less demand for steel, and that has a huge impact on the UK steel industry. So always look for these current examples. It is very important what's happening in other economies, because it has a major impact on the British economy. Another key area for the UK economy at the moment is our level of productivity. Remember, productivity is the output per worker. If we look at this graph on the right hand side, you can see we're looking at the G7 countries, so some of the most powerful economies in the world. UK is here. This is an index. We're at 100 here, but if you look at all these countries, Canada, Italy, the G7 as a whole, US, France and Germany, they've had big increases in output per worker, or GDP per hours worked, same sort of thing, between 2013 and 14. They've all gone up from the light blue to the dark blue. The UK hasn't changed. It's only Japan which is still struggling as well. But all these have seen improvements in productivity while the UK has stood still. And this is also supported here. If you look, as most graphs show, big problems around the credit crunch 2009, 2010. Big fall off in the output per job, which is a measure of productivity. Little improvements up and down though from 2010 right up to now, and still we're getting very low levels as far as increases in output per job or productivity. I mean, what's the big issue? The big issue there, of course, is that it impacts on the costs of UK goods, and impacts on how competitive our exports are, and therefore has an impact on the amount of exports we actually sell. In addition to this, there's going to be less foreign direct investment. This is when multinationals invest in the UK, because some multinationals will look at the productivity of UK workers and choose to set up factories in other parts of the EU where productivity rates are much higher. So if they do that, they're going to see lower cost per unit, and their goods that they produce are going to be cheaper and therefore again more competitive. So if we want to see big increases in foreign direct investment, we need to be a more productive workforce. So I guess the question is, how do we become more productive? Well, I guess this really comes down to better supply side policies, such as incentivizing businesses to invest more in training. Incentivizing is a very important word to use in economics. It's all about encouraging businesses to use more of their profits to invest, in this case in training their workforce, or investing in better production methods, which means workers can produce more per hour. And also, I guess it means better quality apprenticeships in those key growth areas in the UK economy. And all these things are really important and not issues that are perhaps being fully addressed at the moment. So think about that, think about productivity, think about the impact it has on the aggregate supply curve. If we have good productivity, we'll see that aggregate supply curve shifting to the right, and we'd have lower costs for our goods. Okay, the next thing to look at is rebalancing the economy. Remember this, hopefully you're finding a lot of useful information in this presentation, so what would be a good idea perhaps is take a break at some point, making sure you've made notes of everything in the presentation, trying to pick out the key points and adding them to your revision notes. But there's a lot in here, and the other thing that should support what you're listening to here is watching the news, looking at my tweets at Economics A level, and generally immersing yourself in what's going on in the UK economy between now and the exam. Okay, so what's rebalancing the economy all about? Well, if we look here, what we've got on here is we've got the main parts of AD here. So we've got consumption, government spending, investment, exports and imports. It's as a percentage of GDP, okay, nominal GDP, so it's not taking into account inflation. And you've got the UK at the top here, and you've got some of the other big economies right through to China. If we look at the UK, I'm sure you know this, consumption here, it's estimated to make up 64% of aggregate demand. So it's a very high percentage of total demand in the UK economy. Much higher than all these economies except the United States. And look how low China is. Just over a third of AD is made up of consumption. If we look at the other ones I really want to focus on, certainly we're much more in line as far as government spending, though again that's coming down because of the need to cut government spending to reduce the budget deficit. But if you look here, investment, we have the worst as far as a percentage of our GDP. We have the worst amount of investment compared to all these other economies. Then if we look at exports, here we are, exports and imports, you can see you have to take X minus M, so it's actually -2, so this all adds up to just over 100, but I think there's been some rounding doing here. But if we look here, actually what we need to do as far as rebalancing the economy, we need to be looking at increasing our net exports. In other words, either reducing that or probably more likely increasing exports. And also we need to be increasing investment, because as you can see, we are far too reliant on consumption. And we're fairly reliant on government spending, but that's coming down. And if we look down at this other graphs down here below, you'll see that what's happening with our current account balance. This is going back to about 2006. It's become worse and worse and worse. Interesting. Slightly better at the time of the credit crunch, but this was unemployment was high. So as a result, we imported less. We had less of a propensity to import. So that's what's improved our current account balance there. But certainly in the last few years, we're seeing a growing current account balance. In other words, we're importing more goods and services than we're exporting. And that's supported here. If you look at the balance in trade and services, yes, we have a surplus on this, but we have a growing deficit on our balance of trade in goods. In other words, we import significantly more than we export. So the issue is, how do we increase exports and investment, because we're far too reliant on consumption? And obviously this needs to come with business confidence, incentivizing businesses to invest. They won't invest though unless the economy is growing strongly. And of course there's a problem with exports. The main issue we have with not increasing exports is the slowdowning many of our trading partners, especially the EU, China, other countries such as that, and also our productivity, our lack of growth in productivity, as we said on the previous slide, is meaning our exports aren't as competitive as they should be. All this is making it virtually impossible to see a growth in exports and a significant growth in investment, and therefore we're not able to rebalance the economy. Okay, not too many more slides to go, you'll be pleased to know. This is another really important sort of underlying issue with the UK economy, and that's this idea of rising inequality. Certainly since 2010 we've seen a growth in the gap between the richest households in the UK and the poorest, and this is, I guess, partly down to the idea of cutting the budget deficit and the impact it's had on those on low incomes. If we just look at this particular one here, this is looking at the idea that the richest 10% of households had a disposable income 9 times greater than the poorest. This is in 2014-15. So you can see here the richest 10%, just over 80,000, and the poorest, well, under 10,000. So there's a big difference in inequality, and this is growing. This gap between the richest and the poorest is definitely growing. We can also see this happening as far as house prices. If you look here, towns and cities in England and Wales with the largest and smallest increase in median house prices. If you look, this is between 1995 and 2015. So over the last 20 years, we can see a substantial increase in London house prices, and these are some of these other towns and cities, largely in the southern parts of the UK. We've seen considerable growth. If you just look at London house prices, the median house price was somewhere in the region of about £80,000 in 1995. It's now not far off 400,000 down here. And then we see other parts, most of certainly these bottom 5 are all up north. and we're seeing much smaller house price increases. And this is just one example of, house prices go off for a range of reasons, but this is one example of which shows greater inequality, certainly in wealth. This one here, where this first graph really showed in income, this showing much more in wealth. So inequality is something you can bring on as an evaluation point in many different circumstances, but always be specific. Don't just say increasing inequality. Be a bit more specific. And often, if it's an essay you're doing with a case study, there'll be some clues in the case study to use. Okay, almost there. Another area we need to consider is uncertainty caused by Brexit. I'm sure you all know what Brexit is. This is all about 23rd of June 2016, when the UK will have the chance to vote whether to stay or leave the EU. And the decision there is obviously very important. There's a lot of politics involved, but there's also a lot of economics. And if we look at this first table here, taken from The Economist, just shows us that how important trade exports are to the EU. So you can see here 47% of British exports go to the EU. And you can see some of the big countries within the EU, Germany, Netherlands, France, Ireland, Spain, etc., who contribute to this 47%. At the same time, the other way round, EU exports to Britain is much lower. So our export, the impact of us leaving the EU could be a huge impact on how successful our exports are, because obviously if we haven't got a free trade agreement with the EU, that's going to have an impact on the amount of exports we can sell to the EU. And this is an interesting table here. Business investment has been picking up since 2010. It's still a bit variable, but there's evidence that it started to fall a little bit because some businesses are fearing us leaving the EU. So you're not going to certainly see between now and June, you're not going to see any major multinationals investing in the UK, because of course if we leave the EU after June the 23rd, suddenly the UK is not going to be in the EU, and they might well want to have put that investment into a country which actually is remaining in the EU. So this is probably more of a short-term evaluation, which will either be, if we vote to stay in, okay, job done. This will hopefully start to normalise again. But obviously, if we do leave the EU and we vote on the 23rd of June to leave the EU, that's going to have a lot of uncertainty for British business and for multinationals looking to invest in the EU, because one thing businesses don't like is uncertainty when they're looking to invest. They need to be certain or fairly confident about the future when they're making their investment decisions. And if we're going to be leaving the EU, they're unlikely to be doing a huge amount of investment. So that could be just a short-term impact if we decide to stay in, but it could be a much longer-term impact. But it's certainly worth following. There's a lot of stuff on the news, and you should be reading and watching as much as you can on that. Okay, we're almost there. Just a quick whiz through this slide here, and then we just got one more very brief slide. I thought I should just talk briefly about economic growth in the UK, because it was interesting at in the budget earlier in March this year that George Osborne, or it was the Office of Budget Responsibility, but George Osborne delivered the news that he's downgraded the forecast for growth in 2016. He's downgraded it to these sort of darker lines, March 2016, down to 2%. And he's downgraded it for all future years right up to 2020. The main reason he's given for that, or the Office of Budget Responsibility have given for that, is that slowdown in other economies. As we mentioned earlier, the slowdown in China, the slowdown in the EU, therefore less demand for our exports, and the impact that has on growth in the UK. And of course, it doesn't just have an impact on growth. It has an impact on, if growth isn't as strong, that'll have an impact on unemployment. because if businesses are growing not as quickly, they're going to produce less and sell less, and they're going to be employing less people, or not increasing their employment of people. The other impact it has, of course, it means less tax receipts for the government, as we mentioned earlier, and that makes it harder again to meet the budget deficit reduction targets that George Osborne has promised he will deliver. And therefore, it means he's going to have to cut government spending even deeper to make up for the shortfall in tax receipts. And that's going to become harder and harder as the years go on. So the one thing I would say about this, of course, that these are only forecasts. And as in most cases, these forecasts tend not to be what actually happens in reality. So, they could be worse than this, they could be slightly better. Okay, we're virtually there. Just 3 quick issues, which I didn't want to give a whole slide over to, but these are some current issues which you may well better bring into your exam, and also stories that they're ongoing and you should be following as much as you can. The first of those is, over the last year, the big fall in oil prices. Now, obviously, you would think to yourself, that means petrol's cheaper, that means transport costs to business are less, and that's certainly the case. So many businesses have seen, and consumers have seen a benefit in lower oil prices. But also, there have been some losers, because obviously we produce a lot of oil in the UK, especially in Scotland, off the North Sea, off Aberdeen, and they've seen significant damage to their local economy, especially Aberdeen and the surrounding area. There's been a total cut in investment by BP and Shell and other oil producers out in the North Sea, and there's been a significant number of job losses there because obviously Shell and BP don't want to invest in trying to discover new oil fields when they can only get such a low price for each barrel of oil. So even though that's a good evaluation to bring in, isn't it? The low oil prices have had a benefit to many parts of the UK, but it's had a real detrimental or bad effect to certain parts, such as the area where oil plays an important part in the sort of local economy. The second one I want to consider is the introduction of the National Living Wage, which kicks in from the 1st of April. So if you watch this in the next day or so, it won't have kicked in, but the chances are most people who watch this will be after that, so we'll have seen the introduction of the living wage. And clearly for those workers who are currently on the national minimum wage and are over 25, because it's only has to be paid to those workers over 25, so there's a bit of evaluation there. Those some workers in low-paid areas such as cleaning or catering, or in this case the retail sector, will see an increase in the amount they earn, which is obviously good for those consumers, increases their disposable income. However, many retailers, especially small retailers, are wondering how they can cope with these increased costs. So we may see them offsetting having to pay these higher wages with some job losses. So that's something to follow over the next few months leading up to the exam, and we'll see what businesses actually do. And the third story I want to concentrate on here is steel. This is actually big news as I do this presentation, as I think I said earlier, with the news that Tata are planning to sell their steel interests in the UK, most notably their big steel production plant in Port Talbot in South Wales, and government said they're going to do all they can to help. What they're going to do, we're not sure yet. I suppose at one end they could nationalise the steel industry and protect those jobs. Probably not something a Conservative government would do, but what will they do? I mean, I talked earlier in the presentation about how this came about from world economic slowdown, especially in China, and the dumping of cheap Still, so if you're an A2 student, you should think about protectionism and export subsidies and tariffs, thinking about the tariff diagram. If you're an AS student, don't worry about any of that, but just try and follow the story and think about the job losses, the structural unemployment that could occur in South Wales and other places. Think about the negative multiplier effect of closing down those Port Talbot steelworks. All these sort of economic issues are really, try and apply as much economic theory as possible. So these are just some of the issues. I'm sure from once I finish this presentation through to the exam, there'll be other issues which you can follow and try and bring in to any economics answer. Okay, so I think I've just come to the end of this presentation on some of the issues facing the UK economy in 2016. I hope you found some useful things there and some useful ways to really use what's happening in the UK economy to evaluate in your essay answers. And you've seen a lot of graphs and a lot of data. I've just got one more to show you on this final page, which I think is probably the most important of the lot, especially as I'm a Leicester City supporter. But I thought you might like to just have a little glance at this one, because I don't think you'll see this happening again after this season. And I think all of you obviously have switched your allegiance from Manchester United and Chelsea and Arsenal and now dedicated Leicester City fans, so I thought you'd enjoy seeing that. Anyway, hope this is useful, and remember, you can please check my tweets at Economics A Level for lots of other things between now and the exam. Thank you.